Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? If I had anticipated how much extra attention a video named Game Design is Hard would get, I would have not have wasted that great title on the last video I did, which was simply a follow-up video to the limitations of the 2D6 mechanics and the modifiers thereof. However, who cares? In those videos, I mentioned something that might be a little cryptic to some of you. I mentioned the idea that 2D6 isn't just a dice pool system, it's a roll and total dice pool system. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about the differences between roll and total dice pool systems and roll and sort dice pool systems with regards to what they are, how they behave, how the modifiers tend to work, that sort of thing, in regard to things like game design. This is not an exhaustive video by any means. I do not want to do that because we'd be here all day. It's just a kind of a flyby, but there's some interesting stuff that you start to see when you start to compare these two systems. Now, roll and total, been around forever. You roll a bunch of dice, you add up all the numbers on all the dice, and that's your number, and does it get your target number? Then great, you've done the thing. On roll and sort, on the other hand, the numbers on the dice don't mean a thing. What you're looking for is successes or failures. Typically, in most systems, this causes the dice to be split right in half. So the top half of the die, or all even numbers, those are successes. The games that are most recognizable are things like World of Darkness. All those games use D10. And typically it's 6 or greater, although sometimes the target number can change, which is beyond the scope of this video, but it's kind of cool. Other games games powered by Ubiquity, like Leagues of Adventure, Hollow Earth Expedition, Desolation, Au revoir Regime Diabolique, Quantum Black. These use the same binary pass-fail dice. It can be any die. It doesn't have to be a D10. D10. It could be D6, whatever you happen to have. But the idea, you're looking for successes or failures. And so you add up all your successes, you look at how many successes the target number is, and you see, did I do the thing or not? And if you did, hooray, you've done the thing. At first glance, it seems like these things ought to be equivalent. It's just like it's splitting hairs. What difference does it make if I roll 6d2 and I'm just looking for a certain number of successes, or if I roll 6d6 and I'm adding it up and I'm looking for a certain target number? Shouldn't those behave kind of the same? And the truth is, no, they don't. It gets a little wonky when you start to compare how these two systems tend to work. The points I was making in the video on 2D6 was the idea that the modifiers can perhaps be unsatisfying, and you can't always use as many modifiers as you'd like to in a really small dice pool system like that. But also the idea that sometimes, when you want the modifier, we need the modifier to work the most. When the difficulty is really hard, then the modifiers in your favor don't give you as much bang for your buck as they would when the difficulty is not quite so hard. So you can start to look at roll and total and roll and sort dice systems and see the differences between them. Now, with a roll and sort dice mechanic, they tend to behave in a very, very predictable way. The numbers change a little bit over time with the size of the dice pool, and there's a reason for that, which I'll get to, but not yet. But they don't change anywhere like they do in a roll and total dice pool system. For example, say we're playing Ubiquity, and I want to roll one more success than my dice pool might suggest. So if I'm rolling 6d2, the average would be 3 dice. In fact, the average result on these dice pool systems tends to happen 65% of the time in Ubiquity on the roll and sort. It changes a little bit over time, but not much, but it does. But around 65% of the time. So if I'm rolling 4d2 and I want to get 3 successes, well, that's going to happen 31% of the time. If I roll 6d2 and I want to get 4 successes, well, 34% of the time. If I'm rolling 8d2 and I want to get 5 successes, well, that's going to happen 36% of the time. It's all right in the same ballpark. Conversely, if I put the modifier the different way and I'm looking to get 1 success less than the dice pool system would suggest, at least that many. I now have a positive modifier to my roll. I'm doing, better than the task would suggest. I'm a highly competent person. Well, if I'm rolling 6 dice and, I'm just looking for 2 successes, 89% of the time. I roll 8 dice looking for 3 successes, 85. 10 dice looking for 4 successes, 82% of the time. It moves just a little bit, but not very much. It's a lot different when you start to look at the comparison between that and, say, 66 or any other dice pool system where it's roll and total. So let's compare them for a little bit. Because one of the things you have to do when you're designing a game is you have to figure out where are these increments going to be. If it's not a roll and sort where it's very easy, 1 success, 2 successes, 3 successes, well, now I have to come up with a numerical value. And what should these numerical values be? So they kind of equal each other, and they not as easy as you would think. It gets really, really wonky. And once you start adding modifiers in the mix, forget it. Because typically a modifier in a dice pool system is just add more dice. Let's take a look at how these things, just one set of numbers, to take a look at how these things behave in comparison to each other. If I want to do something really extraordinary, and I'm rolling 4 D2s in Ubiquity, and I want to get 4 successes, what are my chances of that? Well, it turns out it's 6.25% of the time. Not very likely, but it's possible. So let me try to model that using 66. Okay, the closest I'm going to get is, let's see, it's around, I think, 5% of the time, right around there. It would be a 20 on 46. It's 5.4% of the time. So let's say, okay, fine. So that's this really hard task. But let's add a couple dice. Your character's better, or the situation's gotten a lot better. What happens now? Well, if I want to get 4 successes on 6 D2, well, that's going to happen. We already talked about it, 34% of the time. What about if I add 2d6 to my 46 roll, and I'm trying to get that number of 20, which corresponded before? Well, now I'm going to get a 20 or greater on 63.69% of the time. The modifiers don't act the same at all. Yeah, and it's because you're dealing with a lot of numbers. You're dealing with a lot of noise. I'll tell you a secret. Roll and sort dice mechanics are still technically roll and total dice mechanics. It's just that the maximum number you can get on any die is 1. So the effects of regression towards the mean are highly truncated because you're just using much, much smaller numbers. You start to see that with a roll and total dice pool mechanic, regardless of the dice size, actually, well, it gets a little bit crazier with higher dice size, the numbers strongly start to regress towards the mean, and you're going to get the results that are not swingy at all. Meaning, when I say not swingy, just like it's going to occur in this particular range. And so it's going to be highly, highly predictable. Is it predictable to a certain extent in a roll and sort mechanic? Yeah, but nowhere near as predictable. And you're going to start to notice that results on the outside are highly, highly unlikely. In fact, any dice would give you a result. What are my chances of rolling 36? The coveted 36 on my 66 fireball. I'm 6th level wizard, if I'm playing old D&D. What are my chances of getting that 36 that we all lusted after and wanted to have? AnyDice.com will tell you it's 0% of the time because it ignores results past a certain number of decimal places. It's actually 0.0000214% of the time you'll actually roll 36 on 66. Doesn't happen an awful lot, folks. I've never seen it. Maybe you have. It doesn't really matter. You get the idea. So, there's problems, or not necessarily problems, because that shows my bias, but they behave very differently. It's much, much easier to predict how a roll and sort dice mechanic is going to work. It's much easier to design around it. It's much, much harder to predict and to design around a roll and total dice mechanic. So that's just something to consider. The other thing that happens in a roll and total dice mechanic is there's a lot of noise. There's all these extra numbers that don't necessarily mean anything, but they show up, and it's because there's these big gaps between the increments, and now they're filled with more and more and more numbers. And all roll and total dice mechanics deal with this to a certain extent. In fact, the one that gets talked about the most often deals with this, where you want to assign value to those extra numbers, but they really don't have any value at all. And the granddaddy of all roll and total dice mechanics is the D20, where, I'll get people mad when say it's not swingy because you're, once again, to a certain extent, it's also not just a roll and total dice mechanic, it's a roll and sort. You're looking for successes. Did I hit this target number above or not? The numbers don't mean a darn thing. But humans being what we are, we want to assign value to all these things. So once again, that roll and total mechanic has a lot of noise. Just like 66 or 10d6 or 10d10 has a lot of noise as well, which might not serve your purpose when you're designing a game. So that's like a really, really brief look at roll and total versus roll and sort. And I didn't even really get into the idea that the target numbers on these dice might change, in terms of what is a success. Like World of Darkness, could change it to a 7 or 8, something like that. In some of the older versions, I believe, is more common. In something like Broken Rooms on these D12s, some of the modifiers increase or decrease the target number, which makes the math incredibly complex, interesting, but way beyond the scope of this video. So that's just like a brief look at roll and sort versus roll and total, and how roll and sort is highly predictable. And roll and total, well, not so much.